Iran had spent decades preparing for this exact moment. Not for a conventional war, not for a direct clash, but for a silent chokehold. A blockade that could freeze the world in place without firing a single traditional shot. And at the center of it all, the Strait of Hormuz, the most critical energy artery on Earth. Nearly 20% of global oil flows through this narrow corridor. One disruption, and the entire global economy trembles. Iran knew this, so it built a strategy around it, layer by layer, trap by trap, fast attack boats, naval mines, suicide drones, underwater sabotage units, everything designed for one purpose: to make Hormuz impossible to cross. And for a moment, it worked. Shipping slowed. Insurance rates skyrocketed. Oil prices surged overnight. The world watched, but hesitated. Because entering Hormuz now meant stepping into a kill zone. But then, something unexpected happened. Something no one saw coming. Because the country about to break this deadlock wasn't even in the Middle East. It was thousands of kilometers away. Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine. A nation already deep in a brutal war of its own. But what happened next changed everything. Because Ukraine wasn't just fighting Russia anymore. It was exporting something far more dangerous. Experience. Real battlefield innovation. And most importantly, a new kind of naval warfare. One that Iran wasn't ready for. Because while Iran was preparing for traditional disruption, Ukraine had already mastered chaos at sea. In the Black Sea, it had turned one of the world's largest navies into a vulnerable target. Not with destroyers, not with submarines, but with something far smaller. Unmanned naval drones. Fast, precise, almost invisible, and deadly. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Ukraine wasn't just observing Hormuz. It was planning to intervene. Quietly, strategically. And when the proposal finally surfaced, it shocked everyone. Because Ukraine offered Gulf nations something no one else could. A way to break the blockade without triggering full-scale war. However, Iran didn't expect this shift. Its entire doctrine relied on overwhelming, slow, traditional systems. But Ukraine's approach was different. Swarm against swarm. Drone against drone. Chaos against chaos. And suddenly, the balance began to shift. But then, the United States made a move of its own. A move that caught even its closest allies off guard. Because Washington didn't escalate immediately, it didn't send more carriers. It didn't launch strikes. Instead, it reinforced something far more powerful. Integration. Real-time coordination between allies. Data sharing. Surveillance dominance. Networked warfare. This wasn't about brute force anymore. This was about control. And control was about to redefine the battlefield. Because as Ukraine's maritime concepts entered the conversation, the U.S. quietly began connecting every asset in the region. Satellites, drones, fighter jets, naval patrols, all feeding into a single operational picture. And that's when Phase 1 began. But no one announced it. There were no headlines. No official statements. Just movement. Unusual movement. Small, fast vessels appearing in strategic zones. Unmanned systems testing response times. Electronic signals probing Iranian defenses. At first, it looked like routine activity, but it wasn't. This was a live rehearsal, and Iran didn't realize it until it was already underway. Because what happened next was the first real crack in the blockade. a cluster of Iranian surveillance assets suddenly went dark. No explosion, no visible strike, just silence. Moments later, reports began to emerge. Unidentified surface drones moving at high speed. Unpredictable patterns. Difficult to track. Iran's response units scrambled. But they were too slow, because these weren't conventional threats. They didn't follow predictable routes. They didn't behave like manned vessels. And by the time Iran reacted, they were already gone. But then, something even more alarming happened. A second wave appeared. This time, deeper, closer to critical choke points. And suddenly, the idea of an impenetrable blockade didn't feel so certain anymore. This changed everything. Because Iran was now facing a threat it couldn't easily counter. Not with missiles, not with speedboats, and definitely not with outdated detection systems. But the real question was this just a test? Or the beginning of something much bigger? Because if this was Phase 1, then Phase 2 would be far more dangerous. Because Phase 1 was never meant to destroy the blockade. It was meant to expose it. Every radar gap, every delayed response, every blind angle in Iran's defensive grid. And once that data was collected, Phase 2 began. But this time, it wasn't quiet. It was fast, relentless, overwhelming. Because what happened next was not just a test of technology. It was a demonstration of dominance. Within hours, multiple aerial signatures appeared across the Gulf. High altitude, low altitude, unpredictable vectors. At first, Iran assumed it was another routine patrol pattern. But then, the formations changed. They tightened. They synchronized. And then, they split. This wasn't surveillance anymore. This was control of the skies. Because while Iran had focused heavily on asymmetric naval warfare, it had a critical weakness: air superiority. And now, that weakness was being exploited in real time. But here's the twist. These weren't just traditional fighter patrols. This was something far more advanced. Because integrated into this aerial network were stealth platforms. Aircraft designed not just to fly, but to see everything, track everything, and strike without warning. And suddenly, Iran's drone swarms didn't look so threatening anymore. Because for years, its strategy relied on saturation. Overwhelm defenses with numbers. Force the enemy to waste interceptors. Create chaos. But now, that chaos was being neutralized before it even began. Because these new systems could detect threats far earlier than before, track multiple targets simultaneously, and coordinate responses in milliseconds. Meaning, Iran's advantage was disappearing. But then, the situation escalated even further. Because Phase 2 wasn't just about defense. It was about reach. Deep reach. Because while aerial units controlled the skies, something else was happening below. Something Iran didn't expect. Because those same unmanned naval systems were back. But this time, they weren't probing. They were hunting. Fast-moving targets began closing in on suspected mine-laying zones. Routes that had been considered too dangerous were suddenly being challenged. And one by one, Iran's hidden assets began to disappear. Silent detonations beneath the surface. Signals lost. Operations disrupted. But then came the moment that truly changed everything. A commercial vessel, escorted, carefully, slowly, began moving through a previously blocked corridor. At first, the world didn't notice, but analysts did. Because this wasn't just a ship. This was a message. The blockade could be broken. And once that realization spread, the psychological barrier collapsed. Because in warfare, perception is everything. And Iran had just lost control of the narrative. But then, the technology behind this operation started to surface. And it raised even more questions. Because these weren't random deployments. They were coordinated systems, Ukrainian-style maritime drones, capable of high-speed interception, remote targeting, long-range endurance, some exceeding 1,000 kilometers in operational range, others carrying enough payload to neutralize fast attack boats before they could even engage, and when integrated with aerial surveillance, they created something entirely new, a layered offensive defense grid, one that could adapt in real time, and most importantly, one that Iran had never faced before, because for the first time, its asymmetric advantage was being mirrored and countered, using its own principles. But then, the ripple effects began, because this wasn't just about Hormuz anymore. This was global. Oil markets reacted instantly. Prices fluctuated wildly. Shipping routes recalculated in real time. Military readiness levels increased across multiple regions. Because if this model worked here, it could be used anywhere. South China Sea, Black Sea, Eastern Mediterranean. And that was a game changer. But it also came with a risk. A massive risk. Because as pressure mounted on Iran, the possibility of escalation grew. And fast. Because Iran still had options. Ballistic missiles, regional proxies, cyber warfare capabilities, and most importantly, multiple fronts. Because Hormuz was just one piece of a much larger strategy. To stretch its enemies thin. To force them into reactive positions. To regain initiative. But now, that strategy was under threat. Because instead of reacting, the opposing side was dictating the pace, and that is the most dangerous position for any military force. But here's the real question. Is this the beginning of the end for Iran's blockade strategy? Or just the beginning of a much larger conflict? Because when new technology reshapes the battlefield this quickly, it rarely ends quietly. And as more nations begin to adopt these tactics, the balance of power may shift in ways no one can fully predict. So now, the world is watching closely, because the Strait of Hormuz is no longer just a choke point. It's a testing ground for the future of warfare itself. But if this operation continues to expand and more actors get involved, then the next phase may not be controlled. It may not be limited, and it may not stay contained to the Gulf. So the real question is, has the blockade already been broken? Or has something far more dangerous just begun? Because what looked like a breakthrough might actually have been a trigger for something much bigger. Because the moment that first escorted vessel crossed safely, it didn't just challenge Iran's blockade, it challenged Iran's credibility. And in geopolitics, credibility is everything. Lose it once, and every deterrence you built starts to collapse. But then, Iran responded. Not loudly, not immediately, but deliberately. Because within hours, new signals began to emerge across the region. Encrypted communications, unusual troop movements, missile units repositioning. At first glance, it looked defensive, but analysts quickly realized this wasn't defense. This was preparation, because Iran wasn't just reacting to a breach, it was preparing to escalate. However, what happened next caught even seasoned observers off guard. Because instead of targeting ships, Iran shifted its focus toward the network itself. Because it understood something critical. You don't fight the drones, you break the system controlling them. And suddenly, The battlefield expanded beyond sea and sky into something far more complex. Cyber warfare, electronic disruption, signal interference. Because if Iran couldn't stop the drones physically, it could try to blind them. And for a brief moment, it worked. Navigation systems flickered. Communication links stuttered. Operational clarity dropped. Confusion returned. But then, the system adapted. Because this wasn't a traditional command structure, it wasn't centralized. It was distributed. Decentralized nodes, autonomous fallback protocols, pre-programmed strike logic, meaning, even if part of the network went dark, the rest continued. And that was the real breakthrough. Because this wasn't just about drones anymore. This was about a new doctrine. A doctrine where warfare doesn't stop, even when communication is cut. And that terrified Iran, because its entire strategy relied on disruption. But now, disruption wasn't enough. But then, the pressure increased. Because while Iran attempted to counter the system kept advancing. Slowly, methodically, expanding safe corridors, pushing deeper into contested zones. And each successful movement sent a message. The blockade was weakening. But here's where it gets even more dangerous. Because as Iran's control slipped at sea, its response shifted elsewhere. Proxies, multiple fronts, reactivated. And within days, new flashpoints began to ignite. Red Sea tensions surged again. Missile launches reported from secondary positions. Drone activity increased near critical infrastructure. Because if Iran couldn't dominate Hormuz directly, it could stretch the battlefield, force its opponents to divide attention, create pressure from every direction. But then, the counter-response came faster than expected. Because this time, the network was already in place. Real-time intelligence sharing, coordinated interception, preemptive tracking, meaning these new threats were being identified before they even fully formed, and that changed the tempo of the conflict completely. Because instead of reacting, for the first time, the opposing side was anticipating. And anticipation is how wars are won. But still, the risk kept growing. Because every successful interception, every neutralized threat, pushed Iran closer to a decision point. Escalate or lose strategic leverage. And history shows, when nations reach that point, they rarely choose restraint. So now, the world stands on a razor's edge. Because what started as a naval disruption has evolved into a multi-domain confrontation. Sea, air, cyber, proxy theaters. All active, all connected, and all moving, faster than ever before. But the most critical question still remains. Can this new system hold under full-scale pressure? Because so far, it has been tested in controlled escalation, limited engagements, calculated moves. But if Iran unleashes everything it has, ballistic saturation, mass drone waves, simultaneous multi-front attacks, then the real test begins. And if the system fails, even for a moment, the consequences could be catastrophic. Global shipping could halt again. Energy markets could spiral out of control. Military confrontation could become unavoidable. But if it succeeds, then everything changes. Because it would mean one thing, that the age of asymmetric dominance is over, replaced by something far more unpredictable. A world where small, intelligent systems outmaneuver traditional power and reshape the rules of war entirely. So now, all eyes remain locked on Hormuz. not just as a choke point, but as the front line of a new kind of conflict, one that may define the next decade, or ignite something far bigger, because the next move will decide everything. So what do you think? Has this operation truly broken Iran's grip on the Strait of Hormuz? Or are we watching the early stages of a much larger, uncontrollable war? Because even now, the story isn't over. Not even close. What we've witnessed so far is only the opening act. Because behind the scenes, something even larger is taking shape. Something slower, more calculated, and far more dangerous. Because while attention remains fixed on the water, the real battle is shifting to strategy. Long-term strategy. Because breaking a blockade is one thing. Keeping it open is something else entirely. And this is where the true pressure begins. Because Iran doesn't need to win outright. It just needs to make the cost of keeping Hormuz open too high, too risky, too unpredictable. But then, new deployments were detected. Not dramatic, not headline-grabbing, but significant. Additional surveillance assets, extended patrol zones, reinforced defensive perimeters. Because the coalition wasn't pulling back, it was digging in, and that sent a clear message. This wasn't temporary. This was a shift, a permanent shift. Because what started as an intervention was turning into a presence, and presence changes everything. Because now, Iran wasn't just facing a breakthrough attempt, it was facing sustained pressure, continuous monitoring, constant disruption of its tactics, and slowly, its room to operate began to shrink. But then came a development that raised the stakes even higher, because intelligence reports began indicating something unusual. Stockpiling, not of drones, not of mines, but of missiles. Large-scale missile readiness. And that changed the entire equation, because missiles don't enforce blockades. They escalate wars. And if deployed at scale, they don't just target ships. They target infrastructure, ports, bases, command centers, which means the conflict could expand overnight, from controlled disruption to full-spectrum confrontation. But then, another layer of the strategy became visible, because while Iran prepared its escalation, the coalition was preparing its insurance. Redundancy, multiple routes, alternative corridors, diversified logistics chains. Because the goal wasn't just to reopen Hormuz, it was to make sure the world would never depend on it the same way again. And that may be the most dangerous move of all. Because if Hormuz loses its strategic importance, Iran loses its biggest leverage, its most powerful bargaining chip. Decades of strategy, neutralized, not by direct confrontation, but by adaptation. But then, there's a final twist. Because even if the blockade collapses, even if the system holds, even if escalation is avoided, there's still one problem left: trust. Because global markets don't react to reality. They react to risk. And as long as Hormuz remains unstable, that risk never disappears. Which means volatility becomes the new normal. And that affects everything. Fuel prices, global trade, economic stability, all tied to a narrow stretch of water. That has now become the most contested zone on Earth. But here's the final question, and it may be the most important one of all. Has Ukraine's unexpected move truly changed the balance of power in the Middle East? Or has it simply accelerated a confrontation that was always inevitable? Because if this is the new model of warfare, fast, decentralized, relentless, then what happens next? may not be decided in Hormuz alone. It may spread, expand, and redefine conflict across the entire globe. So now, everything comes down to the next move, the next decision, the next escalation, or de-escalation. Because one miscalculation, one unexpected strike, one moment of overreach could turn this controlled crisis into something far bigger, something far harder to contain. And when that happens, there's no going back. So the question is, are we witnessing the stabilization of one of the world's most dangerous choke points, or the beginning of a global conflict that no one can stop? Because even at this stage, there is still one final layer most people haven't seen. The layer that doesn't appear on radar, doesn't show up in satellite images, but decides outcomes, decision-making speed. Because in modern conflict, it's no longer just about who has more weapons. It's about who processes information faster, who reacts first, who adapts in real time. And right now, that edge appears to be shifting. But then, a sudden development disrupted everything. Unconfirmed reports, fragments of intelligence, whispers across defense networks. Something had been launched. Not from the sea, not from the air corridors being monitored, but from deeper inland. And within minutes, early warning systems lit up. Trajectory calculations began. Because this wasn't a drone. This wasn't a swarm. This was something heavier, faster, a ballistic signature. And suddenly, the entire situation escalated to a level no one could ignore. Because ballistic missiles change the rules instantly. They compress time, reduce reaction windows to minutes, sometimes seconds, and force immediate decisions. Intercept or absorb impact. But then, tracking systems refined the data. Multiple objects. Not one, not two. A coordinated launch. And just like that, the scenario everyone feared was unfolding in real time. Because this wasn't about Hormuz anymore. This was about escalation dominance. But here's where things take a critical turn. Because as those objects moved through the sky, the network responded. Instantly. Layered defenses activated. Interceptors launched. Tracking systems synchronized across multiple regions. And for a few seconds, everything depended on precision. Because in that moment, there is no margin for error. No second attempt. No delay. But then, one by one, interception signals began to confirm. Targets neutralized. Mid-air. Outside critical zones. And just like that, the immediate threat was contained. But the message was loud and clear. Iran was willing to escalate. And more importantly, it had just tested the limits of the system. But then, something unexpected followed. Silence. No immediate second wave. No rapid escalation. Just quiet. And that silence was more dangerous than the strike itself, because it meant one thing. Calculation. Reassessment. Because now, both sides had seen each other's capabilities, the strengths, the weaknesses, the response times. And that creates a new phase. A phase where every move becomes more deliberate, more precise, more dangerous. Because the next step won't be a test. It will be a decision. Escalate further, or step back. But stepping back now comes at a cost. Because momentum has already shifted. And whoever controls momentum controls the narrative. But if escalation continues, then the next exchange may not be limited. It may not be contained. And it may not stay within predictable boundaries. Because once ballistic systems enter sustained conflict, everything accelerates. All fronts activate. All thresholds begin to collapse. And that's when situations spiral. But here's the final reality. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer just a choke point. It's a pressure point, a trigger point, a place where global stability can shift. In minutes. And right now, that pressure is building again. Quietly, steadily. Because even though the system held, even though the blockade was challenged, even though escalation was contained, nothing has been resolved. The threat remains. The tension remains. The uncertainty remains. And that means one thing. This crisis is far from over. So now the world waits for the next signal, the next movement, the next decision that could change everything. Because in conflicts like this, it's not the first strike that defines the outcome. It's the next one. So the question is, after everything we've just witnessed, do you think this fragile balance will hold? Or are we just one step away from a full-scale confrontation that could reshape the entire world order?